The wind, a mournful predator, clawed at Ilara's threadbare shawl, its icy fingers seeking out the gaps in her defenses. It carried the scent of dust, vast emptiness, and a crushing indifference that mirrored the ache in her own heart. She sat on the lone, weathered bench of the Redemption Creek platform, a tiny, forgotten speck against the immense canvas of the prairie. The train, her iron serpent of hope, had long since hissed its departure, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to swallow sound itself. Hours bled into a desolate afternoon, the sun a pitiless eye in the endless blue, watching her vigil. Mr. Silas Blackwood, whose carefully penned letters had promised a new life, a partnership, a refuge from the suffocating poverty of her past, was not here. The neatly tied parcel containing a photograph of a stern but not unkind face, and a crisp $10 bill for her passage, felt like a cruel joke clutched in her trembling hands. Each gust of wind seemed to whisper accusations, foolish, unwanted, naive. She had traded one despair for another, crossing an ocean and a continent only to be cast adrift in a land that felt more alien than the moon. Her small trunk, containing all her worldly possessions, 2 dresses, a worn Bible, her mother's tarnished locket, and a handful of dried lavender that now seemed to mock her with its scent of home, sat beside her like a loyal, grieving dog. Why had she believed? Because the alternative was unthinkable. Because the cramped, damp room in the city, the endless mending for pennies, the gnawing hunger, and the slow erosion of her spirit had become a cage. Blackwood's advertisement, tucked away in a discarded newspaper, had been a fragile key, a sliver of light. Respectable homesteader seeks a practical, honest woman for companionship and to share in the building of a future. It had sounded so solid, so earnest. She had imagined a simple cabin, the smell of wood smoke, the quiet satisfaction of shared labor. She had not imagined this. This utter, soul-crushing abandonment. Tears, hot and shameful, finally broke free, carving clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. They tasted of salt and the bitter dust of her shattered dreams. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, colors too beautiful for the desolation she felt. With the fading light came a new, more primal fear. The prairie, vast and indifferent by day, transformed into something menacing by night. The wind's mournful sigh deepened into a predatory howl, carrying with it the distant yips of coyotes and the rustle of unseen creatures in the tall grass. She pulled her shawl tighter, the thin fabric a pathetic shield against the encroaching cold and the terror that gnawed at her insides. Worthless. The word echoed in the hollow chambers of her heart, a judgment she had carried, in some form or another, for most of her 22 years. Now, it seemed, the universe itself confirmed it. Left here, at the edge of nowhere, because she was not worth meeting, not worth claiming. The darkness deepened, absolute and terrifying, and Ilara huddled on the bench, a solitary figure consumed by the immensity of her despair. The second dawn arrived not with gentle promise but with a harsh, unforgiving light that exposed the starkness of her situation. Her small supply of bread and dried apples, meant to last the final leg of a journey with Mr. Blackwood, was nearly gone. Her tongue felt thick, her throat raw from thirst and unshed tears. The initial shock had given way to a gnawing hunger and a weariness that seeped into her bones. The prairie stretched, unchanging, in every direction, a sea of dry grass under an indifferent sky. Hope, a fragile butterfly the day before, had been crushed under the weight of this unending emptiness. She ventured a little from the platform, driven by a desperate need for water, but the land offered no comfort, no sign of creek or spring. Only dust and the rustle of unseen things. By midday, a dull lethargy began to claim her. The sun beat down, and she retreated to the sliver of shade offered by the small station building, its boarded-up windows like blind eyes. She thought of her mother, whose tired hands had worked to give Ilara what little she could, whose dying wish had been for Ilara to find a life better than her own. Guilt, sharp and piercing, added to her misery. She had failed. She must have drifted into a state of semi-consciousness, a merciful blurring of the edges of her despair, for the sound, when it came, was at first indistinct, a rhythm that didn't belong to the wind or the coyotes. A steady, rhythmic thudding. Hoofbeats. Her heart, a trap bird, fluttered wildly in her chest. Fear, raw and potent, surged through her. Who could it be? Bandits? Hostile natives, like in the terrifying stories whispered back east. She pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of the station, trying to make herself smaller, invisible. The hoofbeats drew closer, accompanied by the jingle of tack. Then, a voice, deep and calm, not harsh, but carrying an edge of surprise. "Hello, the station? Anyone here?" Ilara remained frozen, her breath caught in her throat. A shadow fell over her. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the worst. When she dared to open them, a man on horseback loomed above her, his silhouette stark against the blazing sky. He was tall, weathered by sun and wind, his face shaded by the brim of a stained Stetson. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were narrowed, not in anger, but in what looked like concern. He dismounted slowly, his movements fluid and economical. "Are you all right?" His voice was rough, like sanded wood, but held no threat. She could only stare, her lips parted, a choked sob trapped in her chest. He took a step closer, and she flinched. He stopped immediately. From a canteen on his saddle, he poured water into a tin cup. He held it out. "You look like you could use this." The sight of the water, clear and precious, broke through her paralysis. With a trembling hand, she reached for it, her fingers brushing his. The contact was surprisingly warm. The water was cool, life-giving, the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. He then offered a strip of dried meat. It was tough, salty, and utterly delicious. Words remained beyond her, but the tears came again, this time not of despair, but of a fragile, bewildered relief. He waited patiently, his gaze steady. "My name's Ethan Calloway. My ranch ain't too far from here. You can't stay out here. It's no place for anyone to be alone." He gestured vaguely at the desolate surroundings. "I can take you there. You'll be safe. The word was a lifeline. She had no other choice, no other hope. She could only nod, a small, jerky movement, her gaze fixed on this stranger who had appeared out of the vast emptiness like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to utter. The journey to Ethan Calloway's ranch was a blur of swaying motion and the rhythmic clip-clop of his horse, with Ilara seated unsteadily behind him, her hand clutching his belt for dear life. The landscape remained formidable, an ocean of waving grass under an endless sky, yet viewed from the relative safety of horseback, with Ethan's solid presence before her, it seemed marginally less hostile. He spoke little, occasionally pointing out a distant landmark or the shadow of a hawk circling overhead, his voice a low rumble that was oddly reassuring. Ilara, exhausted and still reeling from her ordeal, found herself studying the line of his shoulders, the way he sat the horse with an easy confidence, the weathered skin on the back of his neck. He smelled of leather, dust, and something uniquely male that was entirely different from the stale city smells she had known. After what felt like an eternity, a cluster of low buildings emerged from the undulating land, the long, low ranch house, a sturdy barn, several corrals, and a windmill turning slowly in the ceaseless breeze. It was not grand, but it exuded an air of resilience, of having been wrested from the wildness and held fast. A dog barked a welcome, a deep, throaty sound, and a woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on an apron. She was stout, with a no-nonsense face framed by graying hair pulled back severely. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, took in Ilara's disheveled state, then flicked to Ethan with a questioning look. "Ethan? What in tarnation?" Ethan dismounted, then gently helped Ilara down. Her legs were so shaky she nearly buckled. "Found her at Redemption Creek Station, Martha. Looks like she's been there a couple of days." All alone, Martha's expression softened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something like pity, or perhaps just female understanding, in her keen eyes. "Poor child. Come on in, dear. You look half-starved and frozen." Despite this heat, Martha's voice was brisk, but not unkind. She led Ilara into the ranch house. Inside, it was cool and dimly lit, a welcome respite from the harsh sun. The main room was large, dominated by a stone fireplace and simple, sturdy furniture. It smelled of baking bread and wood smoke, comforting, wholesome smells. Martha, whose full name Ilara soon learned was Mrs. Albright, clucked over her like a mother hen, guiding her to a chair, fetching a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. The simple act of washing the dust and grime from her face and hands felt like a ritual of cleansing, of shedding a layer of her nightmare. Soon, a bowl of warm stew and a thick slice of fresh bread were placed before her. Ilara ate slowly at first, then with a hunger that shamed her, but Mrs. Albright merely nodded, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "That's right, dear. Get your strength back." Ethan entered quietly, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. He didn't stare, didn't press her for explanations. He simply sat at the far end of the table, drinking a cup of coffee, his presence a quiet reassurance rather than an intrusion. After she had eaten, Mrs. Albright showed Ilara to a small, sparsely furnished room. A narrow bed with a colorful quilt, a washstand, a single window looking out onto the vast prairie. "You can rest here," Mrs. Albright said. "No one will bother you." Ilara sank onto the bed, the exhaustion overwhelming. The silence of the ranch was different from the terrifying silence of the station. Here, it was punctuated by the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill, the murmur of voices from the other room, sounds of life, of human endeavor. She was still wary, a wounded animal unsure of its surroundings, but for the first time in days, a tiny ember of hope, fragile and uncertain, began to glow within the cold ashes of her despair. She was not at Redemption Creek. She was, for now, safe. In the days that followed, Ilara moved through the ranch house like a ghost, her voice seldom heard, her eyes wide and watchful. The physical recovery was swift, regular meals, warmth, and the deep, healing sleep that came from sheer exhaustion did their work. Mrs. Albright, with her brisk efficiency and surprisingly gentle hands, tended to her scraped knees and sunburnt skin, clucking about the foolishness of men who would leave a woman in such a predicament, though she never asked Ilara directly about Mr. Blackwood. Ilara began to venture out of her room, first just to the main living area, then to the porch, where she would sit for hours, watching the endless dance of the wind in the tall grass. She found herself wanting to make herself useful, to somehow repay the kindness she was being shown, but she didn't know how. Her city-bred skills felt useless here. One morning, she found Mrs. Albright kneading a mountain of dough. Hesitantly, Ilara offered, May I help?" Mrs. Albright looked up, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, then a warm smile spread across her face. "Why, certainly, child." Many hands make light work under Mrs. Albright's patient tutelage. Ilara learned to knead bread, churn butter, mend coarse denim trousers, and pluck chickens. The tasks were mundane, repetitive, yet there was a rhythm to them, a satisfaction in the tangible results of her labor that she had never known mending fine silks for demanding ladies. She began to observe Ethan more closely. He rose before dawn and worked until after dusk, his days filled with the relentless demands of the ranch. She saw him gentle, a skittish colt with quiet words and a steady hand, his strength evident not in bluster but in his quiet competence. He moved with an economy of motion, his connection to the land and its creatures almost palpable. He rarely spoke directly to Ilara beyond a polite morning or evening, but she often felt his gaze on her, thoughtful and unreadable. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sky bleed into sunset, Ethan joined her, leaning against a porch post. For a long time, they sat in comfortable silence. Then he said, his voice low, "This land, it can be hard. It takes a lot. But it gives back, too, if you're patient enough to see it." He wasn't looking at her, but out at the vast expanse, now softened by the twilight. Ilara felt his words were meant for more than just the landscape. She thought of Mr. Blackwood's letters, so full of practical arrangements, devoid of any real warmth. She remembered the photograph, a man who looked more like a stern accountant than a homesteader seeking companionship. His was a calculated need. Ethan's kindness, Mrs. Albright's care, these were unasked for, freely given. It was a concept so foreign to her experience that she struggled to comprehend it. The ingrained belief of her own worthlessness warred with these new experiences. If she was truly worthless, why would these strangers be so kind? Perhaps, just perhaps, their kindness was not a reflection of her, but of them. The thought was a fragile seed, planted in the barren soil of her heart. A few weeks into her stay, A sudden, violent thunderstorm swept across the prairie, arriving with the fury of a cornered beast. The sky turned a bruised, malevolent green, and rain lashed down in sheets, driven by a howling wind. Lightning split the heavens, followed by deafening claps of thunder that shook the very foundations of the ranch house. Ilara, who had never witnessed such raw, untamed power, found herself trembling, the old fears from the station resurfacing. Mrs. Albright, calm amidst the chaos, was securing shutters when a ranch hand burst in, soaked to the skin, his face pale. "Boss! That new fence line down by Willow Creek, the wire's down, and a dozen yearlings have scattered. Heading right for the gully." Ethan, who had been checking the roof for leaks, didn't hesitate. "Get saddles on Joker and Blue," he ordered, his voice cutting through the storm's roar. "I'm going after them," Mrs. Albright protested. "Ethan, you can't. It's too dangerous out there." But he was already pulling on his oilskin slicker, his jaw set. "They're my responsibility." Martha Ilara watched, her heart pounding, as he strode out into the tempest. She felt a strange pull, a desperate urge to do something, anything, rather than huddle uselessly inside. When Mrs. Albright went to the kitchen to make coffee, muttering about stubborn men, Ilara noticed a pile of clean, dry cloths. On impulse, she gathered them. She remembered seeing Ethan shiver after being caught in a smaller rain shower days before. When he returned, hours later, mud-splattered, exhausted, but with all the yearlings accounted for, Ilara was waiting by the door with the dry cloths and a hesitant smile. "Mr. Calloway, you should get dry." He looked surprised, then a rare, tired smile touched his lips. "Thank you, Ilara." He called her Ilara, not The simple act of forethought, of offering comfort, filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire Mrs. Albright was now stoking. It was a tiny flicker of agency, a feeling that she could, perhaps, contribute something of value. Later, as he drank hot coffee by the fire, he looked over at her. That was good thinking, with the cloths. Appreciated. His praise was unadorned, direct, and it resonated deep within her, chipping away another piece of the wall of self-doubt. The prairie, she was learning, was not just a place of desolation. After the storm, the air was washed clean, and the land seemed to breathe anew. Tiny wildflowers, brave and resilient, pushed their heads through the damp earth. Sunrises painted the sky in colors so vibrant they stole her breath. It was still a harsh land, but it possessed a wild, stark beauty that was beginning to speak to a hidden part of her soul. The tentative peace Ilara had begun to find was shattered by the arrival of Jedediah Smith, the mail rider, a garrulous man who brought news and gossip from the nearest town, Clearwater, a good day's ride away. As Mrs. Albright sorted through the letters and parcels, Jedediah, nursing a cup of coffee, launched into his usual litany of town happenings. "And that fella Blackwood, the one who bought the old Miller place sight unseen. Turns out he never even made it to Clearwater. Word is, he took sick on the train somewhere back in Kansas, real bad. Some kind of fever. Died before he even crossed into territory." Ilara, who had been quietly mending a shirt in the corner, felt the blood drain from her face. The needle slipped, pricking her finger, a small, sharp pain that was nothing compared to the sudden, sickening lurch in her stomach. Blackwood. Dead. He hadn't intentionally abandoned her to freeze or starve at Redemption Creek. He had simply ceased to exist. The shame, the feeling of being deliberately cast aside, which had been a constant, bitter companion, was suddenly replaced by a strange, hollow confusion. But the relief she might have expected didn't come. Instead, the old feelings of being a burden, an inconvenience, rushed back with renewed force. She was here because of a dead man's miscarried plans, an accidental survivor. Her presence on the Calloway ranch felt even more precarious, more undeserved. She excused herself quietly, her hands trembling, and retreated to the sanctuary of her small room. The news, instead of liberating her, seemed to plunge her back into the abyss of her own perceived worthlessness. She wasn't just unwanted by a living man, she was the leftover consequence of a dead one. The trauma of those days at the station, the hunger, the fear, the utter desolation, resurfaced with a vengeance. She saw again the endless, indifferent sky, felt the biting wind, tasted the dust of her despair. Ethan and Mrs. Albright exchanged a worried glance as Ilara fled. Later, Mrs. Albright came to her room, her usual briskness softened by a deep compassion. She sat on the edge of the bed, not speaking for a long moment, simply offering her comforting presence. Then she said, her voice gentle, "Child, what happened to that man, Mr. Blackwood? It was his fate, not yours. It changes nothing about who you are, or the kindness you deserve." She then told Ilara a story from her own youth, a tale of hardship and unexpected turns, of finding strength when she thought she had none left. Her words were a balm, but the shadow lingered. That evening, Ethan found Ilara on the porch, staring out at the darkening prairie. He didn't sit, just stood near the railing. "Jedediah told me about Blackwood," he said, his voice low. Ilara flinched, unable to meet his eyes. "It doesn't change what he did, or rather, what he didn't do, Ilara. He made an arrangement, and he wasn't there. Whether by choice or by fate, he failed you. That failure is his. It doesn't stick to you. It doesn't define your worth." His words were direct, uncompromising, yet delivered with an undercurrent of fierce protectiveness that startled her. "You survived that station. You're stronger than you think." Stronger? She felt like a broken thing, a piece of driftwood washed ashore. But his unwavering belief, so contrary to her own internal narrative, lodged itself in her mind, a stubborn splinter of hope. The days that followed were a quiet battle within Ilara. Jedediah's news about Silas Blackwood had, paradoxically, made his absence more concrete, less a malicious act of personal rejection and more a tragic, impersonal event. Yet, the echoes of her abandonment at Redemption Creek still haunted her. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she couldn't truly move forward until she confronted that desolate place one last time. Not to find Blackwood, for he was beyond finding, but to find some part of herself she had left behind, cowering on that lonely platform. She approached Ethan one morning as he was checking the cinch on his saddle, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Mr. Calloway," she began, her voice barely a whisper, then, clearing her throat, she tried again, stronger this time. "Ethan. I need to ask a great favor of you." He turned, his expression patient. "What is it, Ilara? Would you consider taking me back to Redemption Creek? Just for a short while. I need to see it again." He studied her face, his gaze searching. She expected him to question her, to try and dissuade her, but instead, he nodded slowly. "If you think it'll help, we can ride out tomorrow morning." The journey back to the station was different. Ilara rode a gentle mare Ethan had selected for her, her posture more confident, her gaze taking in the landscape with a newfound awareness. The prairie was no longer just a terrifying void, it was alive with subtle colors, the scent of sagebrush, the soaring cry of a red-tailed hawk. Redemption Creek Station looked exactly as she remembered, desolate, windswept, forlorn. The lone bench, the boarded-up windows, the faint tracks where the train had once run. But this time, she was not alone. Ethan waited quietly with the horses while Ilara walked slowly onto the platform. The wind still whispered, but its voice seemed different now, less accusatory, more a sigh of remembrance. She stood where she had huddled in fear, remembering the crushing weight of despair. But now, overlaid on that memory, was the image of Ethan's arrival, the taste of water, the warmth of Mrs. Albright's kitchen. She wasn't that same terrified girl. The station was just a place, weathered boards and peeling paint. It held no power over her anymore. The man who was supposed to meet her here was dead. His failure to arrive was not a judgment on her worth, but a tragic, random twist of fate. What mattered was that she had survived. She had endured. She had found kindness in unexpected places. A profound sense of release washed over her, as if a heavy cloak she hadn't realized she was wearing had finally slipped from her shoulders. She took a deep breath, the air clean and sharp in her lungs. When she turned back to Ethan, there was a new light in her eyes, a quiet strength in her bearing. She hadn't found Blackwood or answers about his specific intentions beyond what Jedediah had said, but she had found something far more important, the understanding that his story, his end, was separate from hers. Her worth was not tied to his arrival or his demise. It resided within herself. The ride back to the ranch was filled with a quiet sense of peace. Ilara found herself noticing the small details of the prairie, the way the sunlight caught the silver-green leaves of a rabbit brush, the intricate patterns of a spiderweb strung between blades of grass, the distant, hazy purple of the mountains on the horizon. It was as if a veil had been lifted from her eyes. Back at the ranch, the change in her was palpable. The haunted look in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a calm clarity. She moved with more confidence, her voice, though still soft, no longer held the tremor of constant anxiety. She began to truly engage with the rhythms of ranch life, not just as a guest repaying kindness, but as someone finding her place. She discovered a surprising affinity for the animals. The chickens would flock around her, clucking contentedly as she scattered their feed. She had a gentle touch with a newborn calf struggling to take its first steps, her quiet murmurs seeming to soothe its fear. Even the aloof ranch dog, Butch, who generally tolerated humans rather than befriended them, would often lay his head on her lap as she sat on the porch in the evenings. Mrs. Albright, observing this, would nod approvingly. "You've a gift with critters, child." A good heart, that's what they sense. Ilara started to take initiative, anticipating needs before they were voiced. She'd have a hot cup of coffee ready for Ethan when he came in from the cold, or mend a tear in a saddle blanket before he even noticed it. She found joy in these small acts of service, not because she felt obligated, but because she genuinely wanted to contribute, to be part of the fabric of this place that had offered her sanctuary. Her conversations with Ethan became less formal, more open. They would talk for hours sometimes, sitting on the porch as the stars emerged, discussing the challenges of the land, the changing seasons, even, tentatively, their own pasts. She learned about his solitary upbringing on this very ranch, his deep love for the wild, untamed country, his quiet dreams for its future. He, in turn, listened patiently as she spoke of her life in the city, the suffocating constraints, the yearning for something more, something real. He never judged, never pitied, simply listened with a profound empathy that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. She began to smile more easily, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. Laughter, a sound she had almost forgotten, occasionally bubbled up, surprising both herself and those around her. She was no longer the abandoned bride, the object of pity. She was Ilara, a woman discovering her own strength, her own value, in the heart of a land that had once terrified her. Time on the ranch flowed like the creek that wound its way through the property, sometimes a gentle murmur, sometimes a swifter current, but always moving forward. Summer mellowed into autumn, the vast prairie grasses turning from green to gold, then russet. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Ilara had become an indispensable part of the household, her quiet competence and gentle nature weaving seamlessly into the daily tapestry of life. She managed the kitchen garden with a skill that surprised everyone, coaxing an abundance of vegetables from the stubborn soil. Her mending basket was always full, her stitches neat and strong. She knew the names of all the cattle, the quirks of each horse. She had found not just a refuge, but a purpose. Yet, an unspoken question hung in the air, a question Ilara tried to ignore but that surfaced in quiet moments. She couldn't remain a guest forever. The Callaways had been incredibly generous, but she was still, in essence, living on their charity. The thought chafed at her newfound sense of self-worth. One evening, as the first chill of winter nipped at the air, Ethan found her by the corral, staring out at the horses, a thoughtful expression on her face. Mrs. Albright had been subtly, or perhaps not so subtly, hinting to Ethan for weeks that something needed to be settled regarding Ilara's future. He leaned against the fence beside her, the comfortable silence stretching between them before he spoke. "Ilara," he began, his voice a little rougher than usual. "Mrs. Albright and we've been talking. This ranch, it's a lot of work. More than enough for 2, even 3-inch." He paused, kicking at a loose stone with the toe of his boot. "You've become, well, you're good for this place. And good for us." Ilara's heart began to beat faster. She wasn't sure where this was leading. "What I mean to say is," Ethan continued, finally turning to look at her, his gaze direct and earnest, "there's a place for you here. A permanent one. If you want it. Not as a guest, Ilara. as, "That's part of it all. We could use a steady hand with the books, with the garden, with with everything you already do so well. A fair wage, of course. A home." This was it. The moment of choice. Not a choice born of desperation, like her decision to answer Mr. Blackwood's advertisement, but a choice offered from a position of newfound strength. She could stay, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she was wanted, valued for who she was and what she contributed. She looked at Ethan, at his honest, weather-beaten face, his steady eyes that held a warmth she had come to rely on. She thought of Mrs. Albright's gruff affection, the comforting rhythm of the ranch, the stark beauty of the land that had cradled her healing. A slow smile spread across her face. "Ethan," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be." He visibly relaxed, a wide grin transforming his usually serious features. "Good," he said, his voice husky. "That's real good." It was more than good. It was a beginning, forged not in the ashes of a failed arrangement, but in the shared soil of mutual respect and burgeoning affection. She was no longer a mail-order bride left to cry alone, but a woman who had found her own worth, choosing her own path, on her own terms. The seasons turned, each painting the vast canvas of the prairie with its unique palette. Winter arrived with a stark, white beauty, blanketing the land in snow, forcing a slower, more introspective rhythm. Elara, bundled in warm woolens, found a quiet joy in the crisp air, the hush that fell over the ranch, the evening spent by the crackling fire with Ethan and Mrs. Albright, their easy companionship a comforting balm. She learned to read the tracks of animals in the snow, to appreciate the subtle beauty of ice crystals on a bare branch. She was no longer the weeping, terrified woman who had arrived at Redemption Creek Station. That Elara was a distant memory, a ghost of a former self. In her place stood a woman of quiet resilience, her spirit tempered by hardship but not broken by it. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to fine needlework, were now capable, calloused from honest labor, yet gentle when tending to a sick animal or kneading dough. Her eyes, once shadowed by fear and despair, now held the clear light of self-assurance and a deep, abiding peace. The landscape, which had once seemed so alien and threatening, had become her home, its moods and seasons as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She knew the scent of rain on dry earth, the song of the meadowlark at dawn, the feel of the wind as it swept across the open plains. It was a demanding land, but it was also honest, offering its beauty and its bounty to those who respected it, who worked with it, not against it. Her bond with Ethan deepened, growing from shared work and mutual respect into a quiet, unspoken affection that resonated in the comfortable silences between them, in the quick, understanding glances, in the easy way they moved around each other. It was a connection built on shared sunrises and hardships, on laughter and quiet understanding. There were no grand declarations, just the steady, unwavering growth of something true and enduring. One spring evening, as the last light of day painted the western sky in shades of rose and lavender, Elara stood on the porch, looking out at the land. The air was sweet with the scent of new grass and wildflowers. Ethan came to stand beside her, their shoulders almost touching. He didn't speak, just followed her gaze. She was no longer defined by a man who hadn't come for her, or by a past she had desperately sought to escape. She was Elara Calloway, in all but name, a woman who had faced desolation and found not just survival, but belonging. A woman who had discovered her own immeasurable worth under the vast, watchful sky of the prairie. The quiet joy that filled her was as vast and profound as the land itself. She had not been left to die, she had been given a chance to truly live. And she had embraced it with all her heart.